number of markets, including Asia Pacific, Europe, and America. He's been working on transforming the utilities and broadcast spectrum, right from grid performance to customer engagement and everything in between. Very rich experience, Matt. Welcome to our panel today.
Thank you, Akhilesh. You're making me blush.
Great. Well, with such a great group, I mean, it's definitely going to be such an interesting discussion. And you know, Kat, I really want to start with the first question to you. Just given your background and where you've come from, but also LimeJump's existing activities, where do you see are the most promising technologies that will actually transform the energy sector and play a pivotal role in decarbonization, and specifically relating to the pivotal time that we're in at this moment?
Absolutely. So obviously we're predominantly based in the UK market at LimeJump, but one of the big things that we focus on and drive forwards in our tech stack is the optimization piece. So obviously as we get increased renewables in the grid driven by the pandemic, you know, everybody wants to see that blue sky and have that cleaner air. There's been so much of an increase in, you know, solar uptake, you know, further wind farms, and also by the battery side of things. So how do you optimize that and use technology to really drive the energy transition is such a pivotal thing. You know, one of the things we continue to work on, and lots of people else like us, is that you have to become, if you're not a technology-led organization, you have to become a technology-led organization now. The power market's changing so dramatically. You can't do these things in a manual fashion anymore. You can't do it at scale anyway. So, you know, what we're looking at for the optimization piece now is how do you manage a distributed energy system? Because we're moving away from, you know, the coal stations and the nuclear and all those big plants that used to exist. We're transitioning away from that, moving into far cleaner distributed energy sources. So you've got, you know, your big solar panels at the big farms, and you've got, you know, your offshore wind farms, but you've also got all your hydro, you've got, so you've got all that generation coming from renewables. But how you optimize and balance that? So it's great when it's sunny outside and it's windy, you know, you can produce this huge amount of power. But then what do you do when it's cloudy and the wind disappears? You know, you have to have that flexible optimization that sits alongside that. So you need to look at your grid scale batteries that can produce, you know, bursts of power as are needed. Also, you need to look at increased hydro, you need to look at the demand side response of things. So there's a huge amount of technology that's sort of coming through with that. So battery storage is obviously just part of that puzzle, but that's a big part of what we're working on at LimeJump, along with, you know, when we look at the UK grid, you know, that whole flexibility piece is not also about dealing with the low piece amounts of generation. It's also dealing with low demand too. So how do you switch off those renewable assets? How do you turn off basically the solar farms, and how do you turn off the wind? It's that balance of supply and demand, how you use technology to really take that forwards. We can also obviously then start to go into the even lower down the level. So you start to look at your smart homes and how that market's starting to develop alongside the EV side of things. So with more and more electrical vehicles coming on to the grid in the UK and globally, you're suddenly having this massive amount of distributed battery storage that's around. How do you access that? How do you use that to help balance the grids that we have across the whole system? So that's a brief summary of that anyway, but there's lots more we could talk about on that piece.
It's quite fascinating from what you described, and what I hear is that there are more and more technology being thrown to make sure that we bring in optimization and bringing scale, and of course solving the problem of variability of demand and supply.
Yeah.
One question to you, which comes to my mind, that every time there is a particular area which is growing and attracts a lot of technological innovation, we also get a lot of good things, but also not so good things. So anything which comes to your mind is something which you think is very noisy, but kind of a fad. So something which you think may not be worth investing, or possibly is being talked about, but you don't see a big advance in that area. Anything in something like that comes to mind?
Yeah, I think there's obviously lots of chat about how we can move to net zero as quickly as possible. And I don't think anybody's in any doubt we want to get there as fast as we can. It's hugely important for all of us. There is no doubt climate change, you know, isn't with us very much. But I think one of the challenges we face, I think not necessarily a fad, but I think one of the challenges we face is how the infrastructure works. So that when I talk about it's like the infrastructure, again, I specifically talk about the UK because that's my key market. It's we have all of these distributed energy sources that we can access, but it's how the infrastructure actually enables us to access them. So how does the metering work? How do we enable ourselves, let's say, for example, in the vehicle to grid type charging scenarios we have where we have all these EVs with all these batteries in them, but the infrastructure isn't in place to enable us to discharge or charge those automatically. That it's starting, and people are very keen, but it costs a lot of money. So it's how do we make our infrastructure actually suitable to work with all of these distributed energy sources? How do we modernise it? The UK grid, National Grid, is actually a very progressive organisation, but how do we get them there even quicker? It's the same in all countries around the world. Lots of these grid companies are very disjointed. They don't all fit together and they don't all work together, and they are classically not particularly progressive organizations when it comes to technology. How do we really get them to step up and meet the levels of everybody on this call? How do we know we're all at the top end of the technology stack? How do we get people to sort of really step up and work at the cadence and the pace that we are? How do we get people to modernize their infrastructures to really enable us to use our tech to get to that next step when it comes to balancing the supply and demand needs that we have across all the different grids around the world? I think regulation plays a huge part into this, and government as well. So regulatory change is classically very slow. They have consultation after consultation around, we want to change this, we want to do that. We need some really quick decisions on how we're going to change stuff, how we're going to modernize things. Should we be changing pricing? Should we change so we come back to metering, there's change in metering, but it's very slow. And the standardization of that's very slow. How do we get all the different levels of the grid connection all talking to each other and communicating so we can control and manage all these assets that are everywhere? It's challenging. Let's put it that way. It's not an easy problem to solve. And I think as much government and regulatory legislation that can support that change for everybody to really get there quicker is definitely what's needed.
Yeah, it sounds exactly right. And I just want to continue that thought and ask Matt a question. So Matt, Kat talked about the technologies driving forward decarbonization and the need for, creating a platform to enable all that. But we've been talking about this for years. Innovation and technology has long been considered as key to decarbonization, but it hasn't been able to move the needle yet. Why do you think that is? And why is that going to change now?
Well, I think Kat set it up beautifully. If you think about the history of energy, you think about the history of utilities around the world, you go back as far as the Industrial Revolution, and infrastructure innovation has always been a part of what has made a more stable, a more secure, a more safe grid. And the technical innovations that are there over the period, let's say from the internet and digital age forward, have been increments upon what was built in the first place in the infrastructure capabilities. That capability will continue to drive and to foster new capabilities and the like. But it's to Kat's point, which is perfectly true, is anybody that's in the utility game, that's in the energy game, it's about how do you best harness and utilise what's available in those innovations, what's available in those progressive innovations and technologies that have come about. But the truth of it is that it's a two-edged thing. One, we have an enormous amount, and we've been incrementally increasing this at dynamic scales, an incredible amount of decision-making information flowing into the centre of a utility nowadays. And until you can actually use the full compass of what we have, it's incredibly hard to actually make dynamic decisions in a way that is time sensitive, that allows you to actually be more attuned to the reality of that 5 minute, 1 minute, 10 second, nanosecond interval of usage. You have to be able to harness that and use it exceptionally well. But that's internal to the utility. there's an incredible amount of information that we now have in the energy sector, in the utility sector, and it's true in water, and it's true in gas, and it's true in all of these. And an enormous amount of information that if we were to share that with the users of energy, it allows them then to engage in helping decarbonisation, in helping peak demand needs, in helping all the things that we strive to achieve in a net zero future. There is a huge, huge potential in what the consumer and citizen base can do to help in that regard, that by simply supplying insight, and I say simply, but I mean it in the advance that we could take is simple by doing so, but it's about being quite specific about that. It's about saying to you, Ronnie, this is what we know about the way you use energy. This is what we know about the way that your particular footprint in consumption could be leveraged to help either the grid, and of course, as a consumer, Ronnie, you might not care about the grid as an inanimate entity, but you do care about performance for your neighbours, and you do care about the cost of your bills, and you do care about the environment. So how do I tap into what you react to? With the information I have and with my understanding of the behavioural traits of energy consumers, how do I then set up a format that allows the entirety of the consumer base to then be participants in helping decarbonisation become real? Because goodness knows we'll do as much as we possibly can inside the utility, but it will take the consumer edge, as it does in any industry, to actually engage in order to take that the full route towards something substantial that will make a difference.
Quite interesting, Matt. I'm fascinating answer about how utilities can do as much, but the consumers really need to make that change. I heard you talk about some of those mechanisms by which you show to consumer the power of how they could benefit from each of those things. Question for you, are the incentives which are going to work largely going to be commercial, or are there opportunities for us to look at some of these non-commercial incentives and be good for good kind of things? In your opinion, have they worked? Will they work? What's your take on the combination of consumer incentives?
It's a great question, and it's one that we do spend a lot of time considering. One of the things that technology companies, that we'll all put our hands on the hearts and say is, we love to innovate, but unless we understand the people we're innovating for, it's incredibly different to make. It's incredibly difficult to make that innovation actually tangible and relatable. Now, we've over the course of the history of what Oracle has done as part of our engagement with it, is we've focused on the behavioural traits of energy consumers and done a lot of study. In fact, a large proportion of what we spend time on is not building technology, but it's understanding the behavioural traits of the consumer to help the utility then engage with them particularly well. And if what we've achieved is any signal of something to go by, over the course of the last, I'll say decade, we've saved around about 26 terawatt hours of energy simply by changing the behaviour of the consumer, such that that enormous amount of energy, when you accumulate it and when you look at it, not just in an accumulated fact and the impact if you think about generation capacity, but also if you think about it in those peak demand periods. And if I can make an influence in that period when I most need contribution from a community to help avoid brownouts, to help avoid me having to intersect and actually make physical decisions about who can have energy or not, by the actual engagement of the consumer base to then take action themselves, or over time actually have a feeling of engagement to do that, incredibly powerful. And to your point, Akhilesh, the one thing that we've seen that comes up most regularly about what's the motivator? What actually gets me to move out of my seat to want to take a change? Monetary has an impact. And it does, and for different reasons, with different people, it will always, we're all human, we all have our own personalities. One of the most interesting factors we've found in the whole behavioural science around energy, it's comparative measures that help the most. Am I, as a two adult, 3-child family, or a 2 adult, 1 dog, and a pool, how am I comparably compared with my neighbour who's similarly based to me? And what are my consumption trends as compared to them? Now, if you go forward another 5 years in this ever-increasing engagement level that we have with greenhouse gas emissions, with decarbonisation, with all of these things that matter the most to people as they think about the future of this planet, that's only ever going to increase. And the importance isn't the ability for me to feel like I'm more superior than another. It's more important for me to understand that I'm doing as much as I possibly can to help the planet and to help the needs of the planet and the greenhouse gas emissions and decarbonisation and all of the accords that go with that. If I can know that I'm doing something that's important, that is a motivator which we can tap into, and utilities have found tremendous ways to make that as important as the monetary savings. And I think if we look at everything we can possibly do, we have to take advantage of every single motivation that's out there, because it's an important outcome for the future. As Kat mentioned, we cannot sit so idly by and expect that by mass marketing a principle, that mass market principle will therefore be adopted by everybody. It just doesn't work that way. You have to be tailored with the message.
And I think it's amazing we're talking about technology and energy, but it's things like, psychology and behavioral economics that we have to also put into the equation as well. And I was seeing Kat nod throughout part of your part of the things that you were saying. So I'm sure she sees some of that as well from her side.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's it's the classic thing in business, full stop, isn't it? If you're helping somebody make more money out of a power asset than someone else, everybody wants to come and work with you. If you're doing the best thing in the market, but that's exciting. If the whole thing with the renewable piece and the change that everybody wants, you have to also make it financially viable. I always say it's not always driven by money, but businesses need money to survive, and if you can make these businesses profitable, people will transition there quicker. It's part of the challenge. I think one of the things that resonated with Matt that you were saying is, comparing yourself to your neighbours, but also one of the things we've talked about a lot is the economics of how do you become greener as a household. And is it at the moment, lots of these technologies and ways to transition are very expensive. How do we make them more affordable for the masses for adoption? Everybody talks about having these smart devices in their homes, but they're not cheap, are they? And the vast majority of people can't afford those kinds of things. So how do we make them properly mass market? How do we make that achievable and make it economically viable for everybody at every level of the society? So that's one of the big, I think, challenges we face on a broader sense. How do we make this an option for everybody to really transition? Because it has to be everybody. It's not just a few people. A small percentage of consumers in the market will not take us there. It's everybody that needs to take us on the journey together.
And I think you touched on a couple of themes right there, and also when you were talking before about availability and affordability, but also you were really mentioning flexibility, so the power of your own choice and the ability to choose different types of energy sources. So do you think that flexible devices like the batteries are they the silver bullet, or is this just one part of a bigger solution that's comprised of many different parts?
Yeah, I think, batteries are a small part of the grander scheme of things. They are not the silver bullet to solve all problems. I wish they could be, but, your average grid scale battery at the moment will run for 2 hours. That's it. And everyone thinks you could store them for ages, but it's 2 hours. They are not economically affordable to build them bigger than that right now. A vast majority of grid-scale batteries are lithium-ion based. I think as we start to look at different technologies around, larger scale batteries that can run for a longer amount of time, I think, that will help us solve the problems and, enable us to move to, more of a 24/7 renewable type scenario. But until technology on the asset side moves along substantially, it's going to be very difficult for that. We obviously have lots of other technology types that are coming along. Like everybody talks about hydrogen. Hydrogen is going to solve all of our problems, but realistically, hydrogen isn't going to be commercially viable till probably 2035. That's, the current things we're looking at. But when we're looking at batteries, and right now, they can take us part of that way. So at the moment in the UK, there's just over a gig of batteries available. If we look at the future energy scenarios that National Grid have published, they say they're going to need 20 gig of batteries by 2030. That's a lot of batteries that are going to be built over the next 9 years. It's nearly 8 years, isn't it now? It's the end of 21. But it's, that's a huge amount of additional capacity that's going to come into the market. And, you look at the planning process that's going on at the moment, there's even more than that currently going for planning in the UK. There is a huge amount of building that's going on. But again, you come back to sort of the infrastructure of how that can support that across the whole of the grid. I think so, batteries is part of the solution. It's definitely not going to solve all of it. It's about the consumer. It's about how we behave. It's about, us making conscious choices as society about not purchasing quite so much, when it comes to the things that we buy. A huge part of I think the problem when we look at the energy stack, it's not just on how do we produce our energy in a cleaner way? It's what we use. It's, it very much is the demand side of things. It's how you look after those supply chains. That's a big piece of it. How do we look after, just buying our food, for example, but the energy usage across the whole supply chain, I know we're all aware of it, is massive. How do we make more conscious choices when it comes to that? Not the whole overconsumption piece is a big problem for us to face. Technology can help us a certain amount of the way, but, it is around the consumers making conscious choices too as a whole.
I'm actually smiling as you talk about this don't buy enough and how do we also play our part. And of course, you talked about the battery not being a big issue. I just want to talk about, I grew up in India in my early days, and I remember many years ago, I saw an advertisement behind a moving bus, and I was a little kid. And I asked my dad, I said, Dad, you told me that companies advertise because they want to sell their product. Why this company, it was a utilities company's ad, which said that don't consume more. I said, why are these guys paying advertisement cost to tell consumers not to buy more? And I still think that while things have changed, we have a lot of surplus capacity, but there's still the concept of that we could live with less and we shouldn't waste is kind of continuing. Do you think those kinds of things will remain forever? Not that I'm in support of abundance and wasteful outcome, but do you think that there will be right balance when we will have technologies like battery mature so much that we won't have to worry about the supply and demand variability, and some of those things flattening will become a lot more normal? So that's the first thing which I wanted to ask you. And then the related part is that what role in your view can regulator play in also managing this whole demand supply with the new tech coming in and not being dependent on what we have been seeing before?
I'm just writing down what you've asked me, so I'll make sure.
I'm intensely interested to hear your response, Kat.
I'll try and take them in turn. So I think the first piece was around batteries and how will that solve our problem of overconsumption, or will it stop our need for it? So I think society as a whole is too used to having things right now and having everything they want. I think, when I look back at my parents, they were brought up in a world where you didn't have lots of money, but you didn't have everything right now, and you mended things and you made do with what you have, and you fixed stuff and you thought about the things you purchased. With how quickly people can get things nowadays, their overconsumption has just become obscene. I think everybody can agree with that. It's just too much. And I think society needs to, this is me commenting on society as a whole, but we need to really take stock on that. I think, the planet will not continue to produce everything we need at the rate we want it right now. We have to make some conscious choices. But so that's my comment on maybe a bit too deep on society. But in terms of, batteries, as the technology progresses, it enables us to have an ability to store more energy. And I think it will provide a certain amount of additional flexibility. But the thing is, batteries aren't just about producing energy when it's not there. It's about managing frequency fluctuations on the grid. You have to keep, the grid voltage between certain levels. So, you'll need something like that. We used to get that from... We still get a certain amount of that from gas, but from the likes of, coal and things like that, they used to come from there. And also that baseline of power that we always need. There has to be solutions for that. And that's not going to come from a battery. That's probably they'll come from other sources as technology starts to develop a little bit more. Then I think, Matt, I don't know if you want to say anything at that point before I move on to the second part of the question.
I'm not sure if it was where you were going to go, Kat, but I love what you said, Akhilesh, about the advertisement on the back of the bus. Don't consume more energy from what we always recognised as an organisation which makes money out of us spending money on energy or consuming energy. My personal observations, and I've seen this in a tremendous number of utilities, and I've seen it inside India, and I think in 2020, in which we may have spoken about it, there's been that, I use India as a classic example of this. There's been the electrification of the country in which those demands which Kat talked about, now it's available, and with the click of my fingers I can now use my devices, my appliances, my everything that I have at the touch of my fingers. And that is a steepling trajectory for the demands of a country the size of India, just as it is for any country and all countries which are growing in population, in consumer needs, in the affluent middle class, etc. What has been most illustrative is when we've been able to work with companies and companies inside India to actually level out the peak need, not necessarily the base need of the consumer base, but the peak need that pushes us into another coal plant or another generation facility, or that we are trying to cater for something which is such an infrequent occurrence. Those peaks are limited to minutes per year or minutes per month at the very best, but we build capacity and infrastructure and generation to cater for the uppermost need. Now, if we can level that out somewhere below the need to do that, that's billions of dollars of saving for a utility. And that's money that can funnel back into more improvements in grid infrastructure, more advances in innovation, more customer protections, more customer engagement, all of those things which can make a substantial difference for the citizenship that sits underneath. But it really is a case that once you hit almost that upper tide mark where you have to go over it to get more generation capacity, and as unfortunately we know that we can't rely every moment that we are going to be able to satisfy that by renewables. Let's hope in the future we may be there. But when we can't do that, we know we've got to go somewhere that takes us fossil fuel. And if we can avoid that, there's so many benefits that can come from that. And cost for a utility is a big one. But of course, there is all the other benefits that flow to the citizenship of this nation and the citizenship of the countries that around the world are trying to avoid that.
And not forgetting Kat's other question that she still answered. I just want to comment on that. Just to mention, you were talking about decision making and ourselves as citizens and consumers. I think it's unbelievable the level of under education around that specific area and the costs, the toll of those peaks on decarbonization efforts and on our environment. I think there's a for us as humanity, there's not enough discussion around that specific area, because you were right, and you mentioned this before, you kind of have to get into the details if you really want to get things moving in terms of actual actions by people. So just wanted to comment on that. And going back to the regulation problem question to you, Kat.
Yeah, so I was just going to actually just talk something about what Matt said briefly, was just around that peak piece. It's a really interesting challenge. The batteries do bring a certain amount of that, but this is where probably the demand side response piece feeds into it. It's like, can we get to a point where we have, this is a really big technology thing, if we sort out the infrastructure to enable us to do this, can we get to a point where we can manage those peaks by turning stuff off? The whole demand side response thing. Can we start to turn off not just your big industrial and commercial type plants, which that's the easy, in inverted commas, way of doing it. Demand side response is hard. It's a really hard problem to solve. That's why people try and fail quite regularly. You can do a certain amount of that, but how do you get to a point where we can, for example, because we're connected with all our smart devices in our homes, can we turn our freezer off in the evening? Because everybody knows a box freezer will keep cold for 4 or 5 hours, at least 12, 24 hours, to be honest, without any power to it. We've all had those moments where we've lost our power, but everything in the freezer stays cold. Can we get to a point where we can control peaks by en masse turning off a huge amount of devices in one go? That's the kind of areas we're moving towards, but it's a really complex problem to solve. So that's just me finishing off on that one. So the regulatory piece, I can't honestly remember what we were talking about in the regulatory piece. You're going to have to ask me the question again.
Okay, I had read this thing many, many years ago, which said that a fool can ask more questions than a wise person can answer. I just made it happen on a live panel today. I didn't mean that,
Akhilesh.
No, just kidding. I'm very funny in real world, so good that you're. Yeah. So the question which I had, and let me just kind of put the pretext on this thing. See, when we come on these panels like this, we can do a lot of thought experiments. And one of the thought experiment in the previous time, you mentioned that infrastructure is a challenge, and hopefully regulation can solve some of that. I find that the decarbonisation is a global problem, and what the utilities are trying to do, or the whole ecosystem is trying to do, is actually solving a lot of problems at a global scale, but they are being applied at a country scale, and each of these countries have their own unique regulations. And I don't think that all the regulations will ever come to one common place. But imagine if you had the ability to say, assuming that you were the global regulator, if you were to come together and say, what could be the kind of regulatory reforms or regulatory changes we could make in some countries or in all countries, which will enable movement to decarbonization using technological innovation faster and better? So what regulatory changes or potential role the regulator could play?
Yeah. So I think data, I'm afraid to say, data is the big problem. And I'd be interesting to hear what Matt has to say on this. But the way that we have access to data, the way that we store the data, the way that we share the data, it is the continual, never-ending problem for utilities and for the energy sector, and most sectors, to be honest. We all spend a huge amount of our life trying to wade through data and use that data in a useful way. We have changing standards within the UK now where a lot more data is being made public. But the big problem with a lot of this data, especially from generation, it's commercially sensitive data. It's data nobody wants to share. It's, this what gives everybody the edge on each other to be the person that will, make the trade in the market to get the power before everyone else does, because they know about stuff, because they've got lots of different assets everywhere. It's making that data far more transparent and open to all, across all the different sectors, especially within the energy space, would drive, I think, a huge amount of technology change far quicker. Having the data in the same formats, having all the metadata the same, it is the age, problem. It's so hard to solve. But if you really did force some proper global regulatory change, when you think about COP26 and some of the things we all wanted out of that, that's the kind of thing I'd love to see come out of COP26. Data standardization globally. Like, how amazing would that be for energy and giving us access to that data at the same granularity and the same kind of timescales? And it's open to all and it's forced on a global scale. Like, that would be phenomenal. That would enable everybody. That would then come down to the technology. It really would, wouldn't it? It would come down to who has the best data scientists, who has the best technologists, who can really make this change happen. That would be phenomenal. That's my number one ask. But that's not going to happen tomorrow. But we can dream. This is about, as you say, this is a conversation today about what we would love. I think one of the other things I'm really interested at the moment is how do we solve, when you talk about distributed energy and the way that that's changing globally, and everybody's starting to generate and store their own energy through, your solar panels on your houses, the batteries you're starting to have in your homes. And making that accessible to everybody to enable that whole generation supply balancing type piece. How do you actually force that to happen at a more localized level? So one of the things we've been talking a lot about is zonal pricing. So at the moment in the UK, for example, and it's different depending on what country you have, it's one price for the whole UK market. Even though a huge amount of generation happens up in the north and Scotland, with all the wind farms and all those solar panels where there's more space, and then a huge amount of consumption is in the south of the UK. But there's a real discrepancy. So how do we get it? So one of the ideas we're talking about is if you move to a zonal pricing, so you have like all these different regions around, you would then force generation to move to different maybe regions in the UK. It also, you force that supply demand balancing piece at a far more localized level, and you can charge accordingly. And that would really drive, I think, probably far more innovation of infrastructure, far more innovation of consumption. This is one of the things we've been talking about quite extensively. That would really then force innovation through technology to find a solution to that problem. So that was one of the things we're talking about. And regulatory change is the only way that that's going to happen. But, the speed at which regulations move in the UK, 10 years before we get there. So other countries do it far better, I'm afraid. So it would be great if we could solve that kind of problem. But yeah, that's just a couple of things. I could talk all day about regulations. I spend a lot of my life at regulations because that's changing dramatically, because they're trying to make these changes to support and drive that net zero targets that we're trying to move towards.
Yeah, and I love that. I mean, we'll touch on regulation if we have some more time at the end, because it is so fragmented and so geographical based. I think we're even talking about a global, just thinking about global regulation is so far ahead. We're just focusing on the local ones at the moment. But I do want to kind of segue on the data part to Matt, because Matt, I mean, you touched on that as well. And it does really seem like data, this panel's around technology, right? And how that is going to push the decarbonization efforts forward. So just kind of want to pick your mind on how data, the boom of data, because of the digitization of this whole energy sector, how is that going to affect us? I mean, we've talked about the hurdles and the problems of getting there. That's one thing. And also just another point to maybe think about, and I'd love to hear your thoughts about it. From what I see and experience, some more and more energy companies are taking more responsibility, exactly on what Akilish said, which is consume less. And data, wow, that is such a significant part of that. Hey, you've actually consumed more energy this month. You should consume less. Do you see that also as a shift, as energy companies taking responsibility for that as well?
Yeah, it's. I think it is absolutely the challenge, the opportunity, everything's wrapped into one with that data answer. Is if you think about what we've done with data in utilities for forever and a day. We've been able to look behind the shoulder and see what we just learned. We've always tried to take, if we look at load forecasting, if we look at everything that we do in that regard, it's about what is the trend that's led us to here and how does that help us forecast the future. If you look at things like tariff reform, if you look at things like helping, consumers of lower socioeconomic areas, how do I help create something to help them meet their, the costs of energy? It's always about what's the past told me that gets me to the future. And to a large degree, I think we've got good at it. We can always do better. The reality is, though, to make some of the really critical decisions and the ones that Kat's talking about, it needs to be real time. It's got to be real time. We've got to be able to inform parts of the market, inform the consumer, inform the network, inform the generation sources of the current need, not what we think we saw when we looked at the next 28 days, when we looked at the next 4 hours, when, whatever that is. And there's no barrier to the processing speeds of what we can do. That's not the challenge. The challenge is we've got almost encapsulated in what can the past tell us about the future as our means of processing data. And I to all my friends who are data scientists and to all of those, we do so much that is looking backwards. We have to start taking the current data and saying, using the intelligence of the machines, which may be artificial, admittedly, that can tell us so much more about what we need to know right now, that can make quick decisions. And based upon those decisions, we're able to make very, very smart decisions around things like, how do we avoid momentary outages by rerouting power? How do we do things about demand forecast and either behavioural response to that or actually, physical response to shutting off supply? We just need to know those things. And you know what? There's so many benefits at so many levels. We can do things such as understanding at that point in time the customer's affinity with a decision that's about to be made. We know, because we can see over the period of time as temperature is going up, if what they're doing is increasing the energy usage of the air conditioner or of all instruments in the home or whatever it might be. None of those footprints are pretty obvious. If we're charging our electric vehicles, down the track, when this is substantial across the network, when we're charging our electric vehicles and we have the choice to think about batteries, not just in the context, as Kat was rightly saying, about what sits on the wall, what sits in the community farm, what sits in the solar farm, but every single electrical vehicle battery as well as a means of offsetting how do we distribute load and manage that load. We're going to need to know how to do that in real time. And until we get to really processing it in that way, I think we'll always be intelligent about data, but we may not be proactive. And that's something that we struggled with. And I think utilities can really lead the way in being the most proactive in terms of in-time response to the need of the consumer and to the demand of what we're generating and what we're supplying. And I think it's tremendous potential of what we could do.
One of the things which strikes me when you talk about the power of data, and I've always seen the data is a great fuel to good decision, but at the same time, data is also a good fuel to criminal minds to do wrong things. And we have seen misuse of data by wrong people. Also, if I were to see the way the grids are becoming smarter and more controllable, I kind of get reminded of the television industry. So when the TV industry was that you could only receive signals through your antenna, you could do very little. But when you started to get connection at home, you could do some. Smart cards allowed you to do a lot more. I see the electricity also is now becoming much more smarter at home, and therefore the risks relating to what the consumers and the intermediaries can mess up with, from issues relating to cybersecurity and other challenges. Do you think, are there enough advances happening in that area to say, as the grids become smarter and smarter, we also got to take care of them becoming more and more secure? Any thoughts on that, Matt, will be useful.
Well, Akhilesh, I somehow knew cybersecurity would come up from you today. So it was only a matter of time. But look, it's certainly got to be paramount in the minds of utilities today. It's we've done physical security around networks for however long, and over time the attacks on physical infrastructure. There's been improvements in the way we manage them, in the way we insulate them as if they were to happen. Those kinds of things are long drawn out over decades of improvement. Cybersecurity is going to, and already has. I mean, we have cases in America, we have cases in India, we have cases in Australia and everywhere in the world where it's becoming clearer that there is an exposure there. And that exposure has ramifications on so many scales, on the economic scale, on even on life scales, because we have people on life support. We don't necessarily have, in all situations, backups for those situations, hospitals, etc. But what we will need to do is we will need to recognise where the greatest intelligence about the cybersecurity is going to come from, because as much as I hate to admit it, the ability for those that want to compromise security of energy, of financial, of retail, of any institution out there, those that are excited to actually undertake sabotage in that way, it's a low cost of entry to do that. It's a high cost of entry to prevent it. And that is worrying for utilities. It has to be worrying, because it's not a department that utilities can invest hundreds of people in, or hundreds of thousands of dollars in external influence to be able to involve. They need good direction, and they need to buy selectively into what can help them. And I'm not suggesting what that is. I'm just suggesting that it's an impossibility for a utility to be a cybersecurity expert. It's just, I'm sorry, friends in utilities land. I don't want to suggest you can't do it. I just suggest it's not in your DNA to be that. You need to find the right partners to work with you to create that, because it is a real threat. And Akhilesh, you know it also well. The damage it can cause and the cost of reparation on those things is tremendous. So we have to embrace it right now. There's no doubt about it.
And I think Akhilesh has already, been doing this for so long. He's already seen some sectors that actually have made that mind shift, financial sector, government, others that have already done that shift in realizing they definitely need that help.
Yeah.
Perfect. So we're going to end soon. I just wanted another last question, because, we've been talking about so many things, opportunities and the challenges. It also seems like the atmosphere is that, and especially following COP and the UN statements, there's a lot of, on one hand, bold visions and saying there's so much we can do, but a lot of pessimistic kind of atmosphere around, are we going to be able to drive that forward? So just wanted maybe to get some of your final thoughts around that. Where are you on that scale? And how do you see the next really just couple of years unfolding around technology, decarbonization, and everything that encompasses? So Matt, why don't you start?
Thank you. Thank you, Ronnie. Look, I think if I look at everything out of COP26, and I admire the efforts and the endeavours of all the nations that went into it, I'm going to say it, I think the substantial focus was on clean energy supply. There's no two ways about it. It was about, what are we going to do about fossil fuels? What are we going to do about the technology that replaces fossil fuels? And there is no question at all, we are going to have to focus on that. But it's only, in my view, one of four areas that we need to keep focused on in order to get to a net zero outcome. The other three, apart from that clean energy supply, energy efficiency is critical, and that will have to be something that behaviours make a big participation on. Demand flexibility, in which the things we've spoken about today, we're able to create an influencing factor which allows us to trend towards when we need energy and who at which time is willing to relinquish. And then, of course, beneficial electrification, where we start to make choices about what is it that we're going to use and how we're going to generate the power for what we're going to use. Those last three are all in the hands of the consumer. And I think we need to rely on governments to look at clean energy supply. We definitely need that. We will need regulation to stimulate interest in moving away from that and supporting what we want to do with consumers, of course. But I said it earlier and I'll say it again, I think consumers are going to be the pivotal difference with the technology that's being introduced. We did studies in the last year with the Brattle Group in the US on what is it that is the real trigger point to making a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. And between now and 2030, those focus areas of COP26 are certainly high on the agenda. They are going to be critical ones for us, and certainly stopping the continuation of building coal-fired generation, of building greenhouse gas emissions off fossil fuels. That is critical, because that trend we need to reverse. Beyond that point, beyond 2030 to 2040, the biggest change that the Brattle Group have suggested is going to come in consumer behaviour. And it's going to be something like double what clean energy supply can supply over that 10-year period. Because by that stage, we have electric vehicles as a real opportunity. We have all those things that Kat mentioned about, the lithium-ion batteries being, superseded and replaced by more substantial and long-lasting alternatives. We have things like the heat pumps, which have started to become, and the thermal sources of energy have become mainstream, and they've become accessible not just to the affluent, but to the general population. And those things are going to make a tremendous difference. And I genuinely believe technology is well ready for that next decade of engagement. The real challenge is, how do we embrace people's desire, because it was obviously there during the global watch on Glasgow. It was clear we were all interested. But now we know, if we know how we individually can take action on that. And I would say every consumer is going to look to the utility to lead them, and so they should. The utility can make that advancement. The consumer can support that advancement. And I think genuinely that, plus the clean energy supply, we can do so much. We do a lot by 2030. We can do so much. And I think net zero in the 2040s is certainly possible.
Well, that's wonderful to hear that optimistic voice. Kat, what are your thoughts?
I think Matt summarised it beautifully, to be honest. We all want clean energy supplies, but it really does come down to the consumer. It's about what we do. That's going to make the big shift. It's enabling us to, and also affordable in time. As we mentioned, it's not just about the affluent. The affluent are making those choices already because they can afford to. How do we make it possible for the masses to really adopt those kinds of principles and the abilities to have access to greener fuels and have access to the ability to turn things off and on to reduce their consumptions? One of the things is, we're not going to have any more gas heating in our homes anymore. We're moving to the heat pump piece, but there aren't enough people trained to put heat pumps in. There are massive changes we need to do our homes to put a heat pump in. I, like most people in the UK, have a gas boiler downstairs that heats my home and gives me hot water. I started looking into how I can replace that. It's really hard right now. So how do we make those kinds of shifts? How do we make it affordable to the masses? How do we scale that out over time? How do we manage distributed energy as a whole, the demand and consumption, the whole balancing piece? It is the big utilities, as Matt mentioned, will lead us, but it's down to us as consumers to make the right choices on what we purchase, what we use, how we manage all of our energy supply and demand needs across the piece. We will get there, as we say. I think we all agree the technology is there, ready to support that, but us as consumers and companies, we need to start driving, forward that change and really making the right choices.
Yeah, great. And so, first of all, I have to say this was a fascinating panel, and I think, Akilish will agree with me that we know this is a good panel when it's so much better than what we planned, and the themes and topics that came up were so interesting. And I feel, from my point of view, the most interesting part of it is that we wanted to talk about technology, advancements in data, digitization, and it constantly swayed into consumers' psychology, behavioral economics, etc. So, and we're talking back about data, and it's again about, okay, what are we going to do with that to change consumer behavior and how the end consumer is so important. So I found that fascinating. And Akilish, I'd love to hear some of your thoughts after this inspiring discussion.
Absolutely in sync with you, Ronnie. I was, first of all, not sure what to expect from this one because we had such varied topic, technology, decarbonization. You can cover so many things, but I'm going back much more informed, a lot more learned. Clearly, the two experts which you've got have a very wide and deep understanding of this topic. You talked about covering some of those things we talked about before the panel. I think we covered those, but many, many more aspects. I'm personally quite excited about Matt's optimism. I think that's where the world is headed. So thank you, Matt, for talking about so many interesting things, and also being so optimistic. And Kat, from your perspective, again, talking about the kind of changes which we are expecting in the world to come and how technology can actually make a lot of those things happen. But I'm not forgetting the underpinning thing which you said, that ultimately it's all down to the consumers. So we've got to make sure that the technology does work, but the consumers are the one who also need to embrace and be part of this change. So I'm absolutely a lot more informed and learned today. Thank you so much for sharing your insights.
Yes, Matt and Kat, thank you so much for joining. It was really so interesting and inspirational. And thanks everyone for attending this session. I hope you found it as interesting and thought-provoking as we did. And thank you so much. Have a great day.
Thank you, Ronnie. Thank you, Akhilesh.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
The world has changed, and it's not just because of COVID. Consumers and employees have increasingly different expectations of the world and the businesses they buy from and work for. Your shareholders and lenders are under pressure from regulators and the market to prove that they're acting responsibly and investing sustainably. All will be making choices about which organisations they work with. So will yours be one of them? Each stakeholder looks at your business through their own lens, and this is your opportunity to choose what's behind it. What is your impact on our planet? What do you contribute to the communities you operate in? And how do you conduct yourself? ESG isn't something you do, it's everything you do, and how you do it. It's your license to operate, and it's your opportunity to lead. Your ESG strategy must be authentic, embedded in your business strategy, and owned by your board. Your ESG narrative looks right across your business and tells that story to the world. And your ESG metrics help people compare you with others, often via a rating. You'll want to consider how you conduct yourself as an organisation and look to the ethics throughout your supply chain. What part do you play in the community? Is your business inclusive? Are you well governed? And is your leadership diverse and set up to hold the business to account? Look at the impacts of climate change, at the natural resources you consume and the waste you produce. Do you pay fair taxes? Treat your customers and suppliers ethically? And do your employees have safe, fair working conditions? And could they speak out if they see something wrong?